afternoon, and welcome to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Steve Mull, a senior practitioner fellow at the center and the university's vice provost for global affairs. More than 1 month ago, on February 24th, Russia launched an attack on Ukraine that was as brutal as it was widely expected, thanks to the unprecedented declassification of US intelligence in the months leading up to the invasion. Russia's unprovoked aggression instantly created the worst security and humanitarian crisis in Europe since the Second World War, with a flood of refugees now approaching 4 million in number, brazen and deadly attacks on the civilians who remain in Ukraine, and a substantial risk of escalation, with Russia's thinly veiled threats to go nuclear in the conflict and missile strikes growing ever closer to the Ukrainian border with NATO ally Poland. While the launch of the attack was not much of a surprise, much of what has transpired since it began has been astonishing. The remarkable resilience and effectiveness of the Ukrainian armed forces in resisting the Russian advances, the evident poor planning and discipline of Russian forces, and their surprising vulnerability, especially at the leadership level, the bravery of Russians back home who dare to speak out against the invasion, and the swift and unusually united response of the West in imposing severe economic and political costs on the Russians while rushing critical military supplies to the Ukrainians. The Russian invasion raises profound, longer-term questions about the appropriate role of the United States and its NATO allies in responding to major aggression against a non-member like Ukraine, and broader questions of how best to defend democracy under attack. What are the implications for the European security order that has largely kept the peace for more than 75 years? And where do we now go with our future relations with Russia? As this invasion reaches into its second month, and there begins to be flickers of hope around a possible diplomatic solution, with the just concluded fourth round of talks between the Ukrainians and Russians today in Istanbul, we are privileged today to pull together an extraordinary panel of scholars and practitioners to discuss these and other questions on this most consequential crisis in European security in generations. Eric Edelman is well known to Miller Center audiences as one of our senior practitioner fellows, with a long and distinguished career in senior US national security positions, including as US ambassador to Finland and later to Turkey, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the George W. Bush administration, and Principal Deputy Assistant to Vice President Cheney for National Security Affairs. In his long career in the US Foreign Service, his intellectual rigor, remarkable leadership skills, and warm collegiality, Eric served as an inspirational role model to generations of Foreign Service officers, including me. Evelyn Farkas, who is not yet with us, but we expect to join shortly, is one of America's most insightful analysts of European security issues, serving today as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and at CNA. She is also national security analyst for NBC MSNBC. She served from 2012 to 2015 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, during which time she served as a vital partner to me when I was serving as US Ambassador to Poland and strengthening US military support in the wake of Russia's invasion in 2014. She has served as senior advisor to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander and has previously worked as a professional staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And last, but certainly not least, Andrew Weiss is a renowned analyst of Russian affairs whose work has had an important impact on shaping US policy in multiple administrations. He has served as Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs on the National Security Staff, a member of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff, and in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the administrations of Presidents Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. He is currently the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research in Washington and Moscow on Russia and Eurasia. He is also the Library of Congress Chair in U.S.-Russian Relations at the John W. Kluge Center. I'm going to kick off our discussion this afternoon with our distinguished panelists but very much look forward to answering what I'm sure will be even better questions from our audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We hope to answer as many of your questions as possible before our session wraps up at 2:30. Eric, I'd like to kick off with you. Last week on his trip to Europe, President Biden said that NATO has been more united than ever as the US and its allies have moved to deploy more substantial forces in Poland and elsewhere along NATO's eastern flank and significantly ramp up arms supplies to Ukraine's armed forces. At the same time, the US and the alliance continue to rule out a direct NATO role in the conflict. You recently lent your voice to support the concept of establishing NATO-protected humanitarian corridors within Ukraine. Can you say a little bit more about how that would work exactly? What do you expect the Russian response would be? And could it risk a significant escalation in the conflict? What else should NATO consider?
Well, Steve, first, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's great to be reunited with you here at the Miller Center, where we've done a number of events together, but also in recognition of our long association in the Foreign Service, as you mentioned. I'm also glad to share the panel with Andrew and Evelyn, because Andrew worked for me when he was in OSD policy 30 years ago, when I had a job which Evelyn subsequently had in the Obama administration, and I was happy to, on occasion, share my advice for what it was worth with Evelyn when she held her position. So it's great to be here. I signed the letter you're talking about almost 3 weeks ago, and it seemed like a lifetime ago in terms of how this war has gone, which I think says something about the acceleration of warfare in an age of social media. I signed on to that letter despite having some misgivings, because as a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I'm very mindful of the difficulties of actually establishing any kind of no-fly zone or air exclusion zone in a territory the size of Ukraine, which is almost the size of Texas. This is not Syria. This is not Libya. It would be extremely difficult to close the airspace over Ukraine, as President Zelensky has repeatedly called for. And so as I said, I had some misgivings. I signed the letter for two reasons. One, I wanted to keep pressure on the Biden administration to do more and to do it faster in support of Ukrainian efforts. But I also thought that since the Russians had agreed to these humanitarian corridors from some of the besieged cities like Mariupol and Kyiv and Kharkiv and others, that it was worth keeping a spotlight on the fact that although they had agreed to these humanitarian corridors, as they did in Syria during the Syrian civil war, they were also continuing to bomb and carry out military activities that were dangerous to civilians who might be trying to actually evacuate, or to the humanitarian resupply of those besieged cities. And those are war crimes. And so I thought keeping a focus on what the Russians were doing was a useful exercise. Obviously, to have any kind of air exclusion zone would require acceptance or agreement by the Russians, or at least tacit acceptance, which I think is unlikely to be forthcoming. But I think, to get to the larger point of your question, we understandably focus on the dangers of escalation with any kind of effort like the one I just described, or others that people have advocated. But I think that is a kind of short-sighted view. We certainly face escalation risks in Ukraine with whatever the United States or NATO does to support Ukraine. But we also need to focus on the fact that if Vladimir Putin succeeds, both in subjugating Ukraine and in carrying out the sort of slow-motion Anschluss in Belarus that he has undertaken, he will in effect be putting a rebuilt Russian Empire or Frankensteinian version of the Soviet Union cheek by jowl with NATO, including butting up against Poland, where you were ambassador. Already you hear on state TV in Russia demands for a corridor to Kaliningrad, which is very redolent of the 1930s and the call for a Danzig corridor. So when we get to that point, the escalation dangers are going to be even more serious and more dangerous because of the Article 5 guarantee. So while I think we need to be mindful of escalation risks, I don't think we can be paralyzed in supporting Ukraine in defending itself against an unprovoked, premeditated, highly scripted war of aggression.
Thanks, Eric. Evelyn, there's been some interesting analysis in recent weeks of Russia's failure to achieve its military objectives since launching the invasion, and at the same time, the surprising resilience of Ukraine's armed forces in resisting the Russian advances. Has anything about this invasion surprised you so far? And could Ukraine actually succeed in shutting down this Russian invasion? Could you share with us what trajectory do you see the conflict taking?
Well, first of all, Steve, thank you for the opportunity to be at the Miller Center again. Last time I was invited to speak was 1999 when my sister was a student, but working at the Miller Center. And I had the opportunity to talk about the Balkan Wars. So unfortunately, here we are back talking about war in Europe again, and humanitarian disasters and the need for corridors and protection for innocent civilians. What has surprised me, I would have to say probably everything. In the lead up to this war, looking at the array of forces around Ukraine, I was confident from going all the way back to, I guess, January when the question first started being raised, that Vladimir Putin would use this military to do something. But at the time, I thought that he would probably make a land grab, in the Donbass area, try to create the corridor to Crimea, so that would help them with resupply, et cetera, and continue to pressure the Ukrainian state in that fashion. I, of course, did not rule out the fact that he might try to invade the entire country and try to conduct a decapitation, but I didn't view it as incredibly likely. And certainly, I did not think that the Russian military would perform this poorly. As you know, in the Department of Defense, I was there from 2012 to 2015, end of October. We were watching very carefully Russia's much vaunted military modernization. When Vladimir Putin came back into power in 2012, he appointed Sergei Shoigu to take over as Minister of Defense from his previous corrupt furniture salesman, not very well liked by the military Minister of Defense. And Shoigu was supposed to spend about $7 billion $7 billion in 10 years. And then it went on modernizing the military. We knew that it was targeted, right? That there were missiles and there were high tech weaponry that they were interested in. We knew that they were not, for example, building a modern carrier. We knew that there were still areas where they were behind, but we never thought that they would fail when it came to logistics, communications, and operating jointly, because coming out of 2008 and the invasion into Georgia, the biggest lesson learned for everyone, including the Russians, and they admitted it, was that they had failures in logistics, communications, and operating jointly. And those things generally, you don't think of them as costing a lot to solve, although you do have to be dedicated. There's a lot of training that's involved. And if you have a conscript military, it's harder, obviously. So I think overall, what was so surprising was the poor state of the Russian military physically. Obviously, the fact that Putin lied, not just to his people, but to the military personnel, and the poor morale, that wouldn't have surprised me that much, but I wasn't really focused on it necessarily. I knew that there would be a morale problem probably once people started to die back home, given Russia's history with Ukraine and in those past scenarios in 2014 that I witnessed. On the Ukrainian side, I would say, of course, we've trained and equipped them for 8 years, but it's very hard to gauge how they're doing without actually seeing them in combat. So I know that we did a good job, but I didn't really know how good a job we did up until what we've seen. So clearly our training, our efforts to help the Ukrainians have paid off. I don't want to monopolize too long, but what you talked about, what I expect, honestly, I think that, so this is a little bit colored by my prejudice, because I would very much like Ukraine to defeat Russia on the battlefield so that we can go to a negotiated settlement where Ukraine does not have to compromise its sovereignty or its values, or at least does so in a way that's minimal and of course is palatable to the democratic country of Ukraine, which is the constraints that frankly President Zelensky operates under. So I think that Ukraine has a chance of beating Russia back, literally beating Russia out of Ukraine. The question is how long that will take and at what price. And so that's what everyone is balancing. But I do not think that Vladimir Putin can come out of this, if Vladimir Putin comes out of this still at the helm in the Kremlin, meaning none of his cronies, none of the Siloviki, the security guys that he has around him, the few of them have swapped out and taken his place. Meaning nothing more dramatic in terms of change of government, which is obviously less likely. If he's still at the head of the government, unfortunately, any agreement that we make, and we should try to make one, even under those circumstances, will be much more like a ceasefire. Because as you know, Steve, he has these maximalist, he being Vladimir Putin, objectives. And I think that in this case, the man does make a difference. And if there was another man, it's not going to be a woman, at the helm, then that person would likely be more pragmatic and might actually give up the whole idea of Novorossiya and allow Ukraine to proceed with neutrality and some of those other things that Zelensky's already mentioned that he will compromise on.
Thanks a lot, Evelyn. Andrew, I'd like to pick up on Evelyn's point about the domestic impact of the war within Russia. And of course, there's been a frenzy of media coverage since Saturday night in Poland with President Biden's now famous, infamous 9 words, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power." What impact do those remarks have within Russia, and more broadly, what sort of impact is the war having within Russia? Do we think that Putin's tenure is in danger? Should the U.S. be actively promoting his removal from power, particularly as the scope of war crimes continues to grow?
Well, it's great to be here, Steve, and really nice to be reunited with my former boss, Eric, who I learned so much from and continue to just hold up as truly singular in my career. I think there's a tendency in the West, Steve, for people to impose our hopes on reality. And the situation in Moscow, in terms of Putin's hold on power, remains unfavorable for the West. This is a person who's been in power for more than 2 decades. He's cleared the playing field of alternatives to himself. So one of the reasons why Putin stays in power is by virtue of there being no good alternative. The Russian people don't have a vote. There's no representative democracy in Russia. And you have a group of people in the inner sanctum who, for the most part, follow orders and who are not his equals, but are his employees. So that brings you to some of the stuff Evelyn was just talking about in terms of the scale of the miscalculation, the scale of the rosy assumptions, and the debacle of the past month. But that does not translate into a moment where you would see the regime cracking apart. At the moment, there has been no prominent defection at any level from inside the Russian state. There's been no public outcry, except in very small numbers of activists showing up in a couple of major cities. I think the largest demonstration had 900 people in a city of over 18 million. So we're still talking about a repressive authoritarian regime that has barely put its foot on the accelerator to crack down on dissent when and if it appears. So fear is a key factor, and the information bubble is also a key factor. So the average Russian doesn't watch CNN or have access to the social media tools that we've all been utilizing to follow the course of the war. And they're basically being fed a lie every day that Russia is engaged in some very limited policing style operation. There are plenty of holes in the Russian official line. And so, today, I think the defense minister talked about operations in and around Kyiv. Kyiv seems out of scope for the limited, quote, special operation that the Russians had announced a month ago. There is inside average people's minds a fear of war. I think Russians have increasingly gotten anxious about that. There is also a general frustration with declining living standards. That's not a new phenomenon. And the Russian government has routinely shown that they're willing to stick it to Joe Sixpack to fund any number of activities, including this war. And then final point I'd make is that the political economy of Russia is pretty favorable for their ability to sustain what they're doing. And just in super simplistic terms, the way Russia funds itself is by selling hydrocarbons on world markets. Those sales are denominated in dollars or euros predominantly. And then the domestic liabilities, paying for teacher salaries, ambulance driver salaries, military salaries, building roads, whatever it is the Russian government spends its money on, all of that's ruble denominated. So there's an inherently favorable spread that when the ruble takes a hit like it did over the last month, it's now retraced substantially to where it was on February 24th. That makes the dollars that Russia earns from its external economic activity go a lot further at home. So Russia right now, just a last point, if you look at the aggregate, the amount of money that Russia earns, which is in its current account surplus, that is quite healthy. Imports have been crushed over the past month. The sale of oil and gas at elevated prices may be in lower volume, but at a higher price, Russia has done okay. So, our expectations that this is going to, the economic sanctions, completely deserved, completely unprecedented, are going to somehow force the Russian government to face the music, I think are mistaken. This is a country which is not on its knees. It's a country which is acting emboldened and recklessly, and we shouldn't be sort of expecting Mr. Market to solve that problem for us.
Thanks. And what about President Biden's comments from Warsaw on Saturday night? Are they significant at all? Clearly, Putin has accused the United States of seeking his ouster for at least a decade now, or longer. Are Biden's comments and meandering efforts to either walk him back or not walk back, are they having much significance in efforts to resolve the conflict?
I don't think they're material. The Russian government routinely lampoons President Biden. They try to play up his age. They try to claim that he's not on top of things. It's all part of their, broad foreign policy strategy that any Western leader deserves to be trolled and trolled again. So it's not exactly a new tactic for them. It is obviously a political hot potato in the US, and you see Democrats and Republicans responding to it in different ways. The reality, though, is I don't think U.S. policy is aimed at regime change. And I think, what U.S. policy is aimed at is trying to promote fissures in the Russian regime so that, all this pressure we're putting on it will somehow moderate Putin's behavior, or sort of bottom-up pressure that would change the nature of Russia. I think there's some faulty assumptions built into that for the reasons I was just outlining a few moments ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, got it. Thanks. Eric, you may have seen the press reports in recent days that the White House has formed a study team to come up with options for responding to such contingencies as Putin's decision to use a limited tactical nuclear weapons in managing the Russian military's declining fortunes, or even using a chemical weapon. What do you think NATO's response should be to such a nightmare scenario?
Well, first, of course, a lot of this discussion of nuclear weapons use is a result of the very public brandishing of the nuclear threat that President Putin has engaged in, actually for a number of years, but specifically with regard to this crisis by hosting a major nuclear weapons exercise on the weekend before he launched his war of aggression, and threatening publicly that if Western countries were to interfere, they would see consequences the likes of which they'd never seen before. Clearly a sort of reference to nuclear weapons. And then, of course, publicly calling General Gerasimov, the chief of defense, and Minister Shoigu, the minister of defense, into the Kremlin to publicly instruct them to do something to Russia's nuclear alert posture. We're not really quite clear what that was, because the terms he used don't seem to bear any relationship to anything that we know about Russian nuclear command and control. So it was, I think, more directed for our benefit than it was to, in fact, really change anything with Russia's alert posture. I think a few days later, Minister Shoigu said, yes, that he'd put additional personnel, on the case. So there are reasons to be concerned about this, because Russian doctrine does seem to suggest, and Peskov, President Putin's spokesperson, has repeated several times in the last week, that if Russia was facing an existential threat, it would potentially use nuclear weapons. Now, how the frustration and failure of a limited special military operation could actually justify the use of nuclear weapons, I'm not quite sure that we should be worried that much about this, because I don't think there's any case here for the use of nuclear weapons, nor is there, frankly, a military case or use. I mean, the Russian military, which is already having difficulty operating on the battlefield, would then have to operate in a nuclear environment, which, as we know, and certainly Evelyn and Andrew know from their time in the Department of Defense, is not an easy thing for any military to do, much less one whose logistics seem to be falling apart even before that. And the same is frankly true of a chemical weapons strike. So I think, look, these are things we should be very, seriously watching. And I think they are game changers in the sense that, as the NATO summit statement from the summit last week said, it would call forth severe consequences. I think it's very good that, for a change, President Biden's not saying what we won't do and is just keeping silent about what we might do. But I think there are any number of things that we could do, including launching a conventional strike on whatever unit, in fact, launched a nuclear or chemical weapon. And because I do think this would change the whole nature of what we're talking about here.
Thanks. Looking more broadly at the conduct of this war from the Russian perspective, Evelyn, I wonder if you might share your perspective. What are there any lessons in how Russia is conducting this war for how we would go to war, God forbid, against Russia as a NATO alliance? Do you see any trends or patterns in how Russia is conducting this war that would warrant a change in NATO's military planning assumptions?
I guess I would say, Steve, the thing that stands out, even though it shouldn't have surprised any of us, is the brutal way that the Russians fight. And this is, of course, the playbook they used in Chechnya and in Syria. But I don't think we expected them to use it in this fashion against their Ukrainian, Slavic brethren. So looking at how they would fight against the United States and the West, we can now imagine that they would also target civilian populations, and not just we were aware that they would use cyber attacks, for example, to take down critical infrastructure, so electricity, water supply. They have put bots on a lot of parts of our grid, which they could utilize in a time of war, which then could lead to humanitarian problems, right? Hospitals losing access to electricity and water and the like. But the fact that they, target the civilians directly in order to try to get at the will of the people and the will of the government is something that I don't think we have fully accounted for in terms of how we plan to fight Russia. We know that they have a spectrum, from peace to war, where they're basically at war the whole time. But I don't think we've thought through how they do not really delineate between civilians and combatants. And the Ukrainians now, of course, have used that to their advantage. So all the civilians are now geared up with all kinds of equipment, and they're also now in the war. So the Russians now have to turn around and they're in the middle of a resistance. So I guess the basic lesson learned is that one. And I think it's really a challenge to the international order and the way that I taught at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College for 4 years. The biggest thing we try to get, especially our foreign students, to understand is that there are rules in war. That's precisely why you have them, so that when you go to war, you don't descend to the lowest, lowest rung of hell, if you will, because we learned in the Second World War what that does. It just hurts everyone. So this is a huge challenge to the international order. And unfortunately, so far, we haven't really seen the international leadership, the United Nations and other entities that should be speaking up and helping our leaders, President Biden and others, defend the international order and hold the Russians accountable and really stop them from what they're doing. We haven't seen that yet. I feel like we had more voices and we had more active engagement on that front in the Balkan wars. And maybe it's because, we need Madeleine Albright back, although our ambassador is doing a great job,
Steve, could I just pick up on something that Evelyn said, and it goes to a comment Andrew made as well. I don't disagree with Andrew's assessment of where things are today at this moment in terms of inside Russia and the impact of the so far failure of the Russian military operation on Russian domestic politics. But I think we should be alert to some things that are happening right now. So one of the things that appears to be happening, based on some of the intercepted phone calls, because the Russians are stealing a lot of cell phones and using those cell phones, which the Ukrainians monitor. And what appears to be happening on a lot of these phone calls back home is Russian soldiers registering real shock at the circumstances they're finding in Ukraine. I mean, they'd been led to believe that Ukraine was a failing state and it had all these problems and it was being manipulated but what they're finding is that actually Ukraine was better off than the parts of Russia where most of them are from, because they're not, most of these conscripts are not from, the few large urban areas or areas connected directly to the extraction of hydrocarbons, as Andrew was pointing out, that have been the beneficiaries of Putin's 20-year rule. They're parts of Russia where nothing has changed very much in the last 20 years. And that's feeding a kind of rage. Ann Applebaum pointed out recently that this is very similar to the kind of rage that the Soviet soldiers experienced when they started to liberate Eastern Europe from the Nazis in 1945 and marched their way to Berlin. And it fueled a wave of looting and rape across the continent that we're beginning to see replicated in Ukraine. And at some point, that's going to blow back into Russia, because those troops are going to go home and they're going to start telling people about what they found, and their relatives who've heard about this from them by phone are going to start telling people what they've found. We've seen in the last day or so news leaking out that Russian state has directed that local authorities not publicize funerals of soldiers coming back from Ukraine in body bags. We know that Putin is extremely casualty sensitive to this. It's the reason why he directed the murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was working on a documentary about casualties from the first war in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. So this is all going to start to leach back into Russian, society, despite the best efforts of the regime to prevent people from knowing about it. And at some point, I do believe that's going to start to have some impact, as will the sanctions over time. I mean, Andrew's quite right that the regime, I think, has already been under sanctions since 2014, 2015, tried to sanction-proof itself. Some of what the administration has done has actually made it tougher for those sanction-proofing efforts to bear fruit. So, for instance, very difficult for Russia now to liquidate any of its gold holdings, for instance, and generate actual funds from that. So over time, I think there's going to be, serious costs that Putin's going to have to answer to. I agree with Andrew that in the short term, we're not going to see much change. I think in the longer run, failed Russian military efforts historically have not worked out well for the leadership.
Fascinating point, Eric. Thanks. And of course, the kind of implications of this phenomenon within Russia also could have implications more broadly internationally, regardless of how this war ends up. There's no question that the geopolitical environment is going to be substantially changed from what we've been facing since the end of the Cold War. Andrew, I wonder if we could get from you any early thoughts that you might have on once we get beyond this invasion, regardless of how it ends, how should we be approaching Russia along with our allies? Are we looking at some kind of neo-containment policy or something more aggressive to push back against Russian, clearly reestablished imperial aspirations?
So it's a tricky question, in part because I'm not sure we're going to get past the invasion part. And my fear, and it's just hypothesis, is that this war is going to start to morph and take on features of what we saw in Bosnia, as Evelyn mentioned, in the 1990s. And so you could end up where this conflict basically stays unresolved. You have large-scale Russian military activity inside Ukraine. You have either Ukrainian residual military capability combating that, or some form of Western-supported insurgency. And then you have the problem of escalation and spillover. And that becomes sort of job one for Western leaders to contend with. If that happens and we have a kind of long-term source of instability in an area that adjoins 5 NATO countries, that will be plenty challenging. The question will be, to what extent do the Russians want to make trouble elsewhere? I would argue a lot of the trouble that Russia's been making since 2014 in various parts of the world, in part, was to create bright, shiny objects and to kind of have forced the West to take its eye off the ball in terms of what Russia really cared about, which was Ukraine and other issues close to home. So as we move to a sort of more global adversarial relationship with Russia, which is, I think, inescapable, the question for any U.S. administration is going to be to set priorities, and that we should not necessarily be in a game of whack-a-mole. And we've been doing that, unfortunately, for the last several years, where if 10 Russians show up in some small sub-Saharan African country or somewhere else, it becomes the topic of far more energy and forcefulness within the U.S. government than dealing with our Ukraine problem. So Ukraine has been basically a kind of abandoned policy issue for much of the last 7 years or so. At least, under Trump, it was a non-priority, and then, into the new administration, there were other, issues like climate change, the pandemic, racial justice that obviously took pride of place. So we're not going to have that luxury, I think, anymore. We're going to have a partner in Ukraine that badly needs our help, and that is potentially not able to defeat Russia, but is in a position to kind of tie Russia down indefinitely. Beyond that, the questions of nuclear stability and arms racing are really important. The questions of the possible risks of escalation in new domains like cyber and space are very real and serious. They're not areas I'm an expert on. And then finally is the sort of newfound partnership between Russia and China, and the extent to which those two powers have a joint either agenda or set of goals to degrade US power, to impact the shape of the global system, to advantage them, or at least to kind of take some of the heat off them for things they're doing, which are at odds with the interests of international peace and security.
Thanks. I'd like to turn to some questions from our audience, and just to remind the audience, please, if you do have questions, please enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is a question for the whole panel from Steve Kosti. To what extent and how effective is U.S. military intelligence for Ukraine?
We'll
Well,
let the senior guy start.
I'm not sure we know all the details here. Um, but what I think you can say is that Ukrainians have been doing an incredibly effective job of, at a minimum, attacking Russian logistics. So, I mean, some of the logistics breakdowns, as Evelyn was suggesting, are a function of kind of internal rot and corruption inside the Russian military. But some of it is because those logistical elements have been targeted very explicitly by the Ukrainians. Whether they're doing that on their own or with the help of U.S. Intelligence, I don't know. But there's some indication that some of their targeting has been done with assistance from the U.S. I certainly hope so.
I have seen media reports that indicate that we are providing intelligence to the Ukrainians. This was a big lesson learned from 2014, where we were reticent to share intelligence with our NATO allies. And so Ukraine was a whole nother category. And of course, at that time, Ukraine was much more heavily penetrated by Russian intelligence, which isn't to say that it isn't today, it is, but it was a bigger problem that they hadn't yet tackled. But I also think it's not just that we're providing intelligence, but I think some of it may actually be real-time intelligence. And we found clever ways to share that with them. They also have access to some commercial intelligence. I mean, President Zelensky was, appealing to I think it's called Mazar, one of the biggest commercial companies selling this information. Of course, he has Elon Musk helping him with communication. So clearly we are helping them. But it's not just providing the intelligence to them. We've along the way trained them about how to collect and use intelligence as well.
Thanks. Speaking of intelligence, and I'm sure all three of you on the panel will remember the challenges when you're actually serving as a diplomat on the uses of intelligence we get when we serve as ambassadors overseas or sit back at home developing policies. Just really incredible intelligence to help inform our decisions and shaping our priorities. But there traditionally have been a lot of constraints on how you use it. You don't want to betray sources and methods. You don't want to tip off potential adversaries what you know, because that can be a strength in whatever issue you're trying to conduct. So the conduct of the Biden administration in the months leading up to the war completely turned that concept on its head. And all of a sudden, every day, especially as we got closer to the invasion itself, there was sort of an amazing array of intelligence shared not only through regular diplomatic channels with our allies, but also with the public at large. I suspect historians will have a field day in the future evaluating this as a tactic, but I wonder if the three of you have views on was this a wise thing to do, or should we have handled it another way?
Well, I've written on the subject, Steve, as you know. Look, I think the administration, which had a very weak hand to play for a variety of reasons, some of which Andrew mentioned in his comment a minute ago, chose to pursue what I have called a strategy of deterrence by disclosure. And by disclosing what we knew about Russian planning, we did a couple of things. One, we took them a little bit out of their operational rhythm. I mean, this is something we learned from our counterterrorism efforts over the last 20 years, that if you publicize details of a plot, you take people out of their operational rhythm, and that complicates their doing what they're trying to accomplish. And I think they had some success with that. Moreover, I think they forced President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and others, Peskov, to deny publicly, repeatedly, that they were going to invade Ukraine. And I think that had multiple positive consequences in the end. One was it increased the shock value in Europe of what Putin actually did in the end of the day, which I think helped. I mean, it bought time for the administration to line up the allies and line up the sanctions, but it also increased the shock value. So when it finally happened, people were, taken aback by the fact that this was something Putin had said repeatedly he wasn't going to do, and then he did it. And I think that's helped the administration enormously in its efforts at coalition maintenance and alliance management over the last month or so, and I think that's been all to the good. You have to weigh that against the sources and methods, and I think there's also a little bit of a problem lingering here, which is because of what they've done. If it turns out that, as Evelyn was suggesting in her opening remarks, that as I was like her, I thought he was just going to grab the Donbass while threatening this much larger operation. If he goes back to that now and just says, "Well, I just want the Donbass," there will be, I'm afraid, a tendency in some quarters, particularly in Europe, to say, "Oh, well, whew, thank God that's all done with now." And I think the significance of President Biden's 9 words, which are in his long public career probably the only 9 words I absolutely unreservedly agree with, is that once whatever conclusion there is, that whatever war termination we find here, we just can't go back to business as usual with Russia as long as he's in charge. And I think that's an ongoing reality. I mean, this is the most exquisite illustration of Michael Kinsley's iron law of gaffes, which is you only get in trouble in Washington when you accidentally say something that everybody knows to be true.
Thanks, Eric. Evelyn and Andrew, any thoughts on the question?
Well, I'll just say briefly, what I would add is that, because I agree with everything Eric said about the fact that it was very, very helpful and very disruptive to the Russians. And I think that the Director Burns and Director Haynes, I mean, they are people I worked with, in the last administration. They saw how hobbled we were by this overzealousness to protect the sources and methods. And so the only thing that I would like to add is, in the domestic context, I wish we would be also a little bit more daring, because I, am just so still distraught over 2016 and the Russian interference in our domestic elections. That story has yet to be told. I know the sources and methods, so I know that we have good ones. And so when the Obama administration started talking publicly, which of course they were not very daring in general about talking publicly about threats, and certainly not about Russia, I knew that there was something there. And yet to this day, we still don't have, I don't think, partly maybe because of compartmentalization in the intelligence community. Maybe Mueller's people never even actually saw the intelligence. But I am concerned that the American people still don't know what happened there. And there was definitely collaboration, or whatever C word you want to pick. And there were Russians buying access to political parties, and they're not the only foreigners. That's still ongoing. I am worried about corruption in politics, corruption in society. That's a whole nother topic, Steve, that we could talk about. Read Moneyland. Your students should read it. It's a few years old, but it's not outdated, sadly. And it's got a lot of interesting, fun stories in there. So that's what I would add, is that we should do it in the domestic context as well.
Right. Yeah, great point, Evelyn. Thanks. How about you, Andrew? Any thoughts on the use of intelligence?
I agree with Eric. I think this was the administration operating as best it could in the wake, especially of what had happened in Afghanistan in the summer, to try to make sure that it had its act together and that it had as much international support and buy-in. And they succeeded, I think, well beyond their own expectations. I think the challenge now is that, having leaned really hard on the economic sanctions to do a lot of the work and to sort of blow past some of the established either parameters or expectations for the kind of sanctions that could be applied, there's not a lot of headroom. And so as this crisis escalates, you're only left with a handful of remaining measures to apply. And it's just, to stretch the Bosnia metaphor again, it's just a matter of time before there are more atrocities, more war crimes, and other things that happen that force the hand of Western leaders. And there's going to be this bottom-up pressure. We've seen nothing like it, at least in my lifetime, from within societies in the West to do something to stop the senselessness of this war. And you see the stampede that Western policymakers are facing from their own publics. It's more about the sort of sense that this is wrong and that the West cannot accept this. That's visible to all citizens, I think, in representative democracies today, and that is going to keep the heat on the Biden administration. It's going to keep the heat on European governments. And then I would just point out, I'm not an expert on U.S. domestic politics, but if you look at least the NBC poll that was released 2 days ago, there's a sense that Americans are really worried about this, and they're worried about how the war affects inflationary expectations. They're worried about the possibility of the U.S. going to war with Russia. There was kind of an extraordinary number. I think it's something like more than 2/3 of Americans either think the United States is already at war with Russia or will be at war with Russia within the next year. So this crisis has unleashed a set of feelings inside, Joe Americans' mind about how real the stakes are for our own country's security and prosperity, unlike anything, at least that I can remember since 9/11. So, keeping those sort of bottom-up concerns, either informing people of what the real risks are, what they're not, and sort of what the challenges are for our policy. Because this is not, not to repeat myself, but we're not going to have Putin crawl out of his bunker tomorrow with a white flag. Like, this is going to be a long-term challenge to manage Russia's behavior and to manage Putin's risk appetite. And the more we keep the heat on, the better. But we shouldn't, be naive about who we're dealing with. This is a person who has used escalation as a friend in challenging situations, and I think it's partly because of that people are so worried about what Putin might do. And then to just bring us back to some of the stuff Evelyn was talking about, we got Russian interference in our democracy in 2016 in part as a byproduct of the pressure that the West had rightfully put on Russia after the 2014 war. So, the beginning of the war in 2014. So, there's a long line you can draw here of Russian transgression and boundary challenging and stepping over the line, and there's no reason to think that pattern of behavior is over. We're entering a new phase of confrontation with Russia, and it's going to put a lot of demands on the president's bandwidth and other Western leaders' bandwidth to deal with that problem successfully.
Steve, I agree with everything both Evelyn and Andrew just said, but before we leave the subject of the deterrence by disclosure, there's one other thing I think it's worth noting. A lot of people have talked about how much Ukraine, at least in the West, has dominated sort of the information space since February 24th. I think, it's worth bearing in mind that if you look at the General Assembly vote, although it was overwhelmingly against Russia, the 50 countries or so that either voted no or abstained represent actually a majority of the world's population. So while in the West, Ukraine has won the information war, I'm not sure it's true globally, but to the degree that it's happened in the West, the Biden administration, I think, can take a certain amount of credit because, again, forcing Putin and Lavrov and others to deny that they were going to invade, exposing them as the liars that they are and have been throughout their careers, also created a presumption of disbelief about everything they've said subsequently about the war in Ukraine. And that set the conditions, I think, for Ukraine to be so dominant in the information space.
As did President Zelensky's leadership.
Yes,
and experience.
Absolutely. Oh, no, absolutely, Evelyn. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and it's a great reality check, Eric, about how the rest of the world perceives this conflict. I was in Morocco last week on university business. It was a real wake-up call speaking to people there in Morocco. They, of course, have their own history and seizing territory next door to them, so that certainly conditions their view. But they tended to view this as just another conflict between the United States and Russia, of which they really have no interest or part. And the moral resonance of what's happened to the Ukrainians that we see every day in the press in the West just isn't there. And so that's definitely worth keeping in mind as the broader diplomatic process goes forward. We have a question from Douglas Stickey in the audience, which addresses the fundamental question of who's to blame for this conflict. Of course, in the mainstream in the West, Russia is the aggressor. But there's a small but significant group led by people like John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt and other in the realist schools that the United States has its share of blame for provoking this. But Douglas asked, what are the panel's thoughts on balancing Russia's obvious aggression with the perceived U.S. Western aggression that we sparked by laying out a path for Ukraine to become a member of NATO? Andrew.
So I think this is one of these canards that the Russians have foisted on well-meaning Western audiences to try to excuse what they did, which is they carved up a neighbor's territory, they started a war of aggression, and then now we're all living with the consequences. So instead, the Russians would much rather have us talk about why is the United States bankrolling European security? Why is the US, talking about an inclusive vision for bringing various countries that aspire to be part of our community, joining institutions like NATO? The Russians would love to have that conversation, but they don't want to have the other one. That's part one. And then part two is Vladimir Putin is an opportunist. He's not a big strategist. And he bossed Ukraine twice. This is a neighboring country that holds unique importance to him in security and other sort of more metaphysical senses. And this is the biggest black mark on the guy's record. And he lost it in 2004. He lost it in 2014 again. And he smelled an opportunity this time to get it back. And he's miscalculated horribly. And he thought that Joe Biden was weak. He thought the Europeans would roll over. And he thought that the Ukrainians would basically welcome him with open arms. And he was wrong on all three counts. So it's all, worked out poorly. But, in certain, parts of the, world, people love to talk about how it's all America's fault and it's not Vladimir Putin's fault. And I just think we've got to, we just have to face up to the fact that there's a aggressive and unreconstructed person running Russia today who is willing to make such enormous risks and gambles and throw, his own society into a open-ended conflict against a neighboring country that poses no threat to it. So this is, the height of Putin's obtuseness and strategic shortcoming as a leader on display. It's not America's fault. And I just think we really have to be clear about that.
Can I add something from a little more academic, using more academic lingo, and then that gives Eric the last word. The Mearsheimer approach is very hardcore realist. And frankly speaking, Vladimir Putin is also a hardcore realist. He believes, Thucydides, and I'm going to get the phrase wrong, even though I taught it for all those years, but, the strong do what they will, the weak
suffer what they must.
Right? So this is the sphere of influence, system that we've had for, ever since the beginning of humankind practically. And it's what brought us to World War I and World War II. And the reason we set up the current system is because we decided that smaller states deserve some protection. And, minorities within smaller states, et cetera, humans deserve some protection. And so we set up this entire system, which Vladimir Putin doesn't like, because he, as a large, the man in charge of a large federation, a large state, wants to be able to have a sphere of influence, throw us back to the 19th century and tell Ukraine how they're going to live their lives and tell Ukrainians how they're going to live their lives. So it's fundamentally, realist in a very hardcore way that challenges our entire international order. So for those of us who like to consider ourselves kind of like neoliberal realists, or I used to, come up with these new terms, meaning we take into account all the other things that matter, it's not acceptable. But over to Eric.
Well, and by the way, China also thinks it's a very big country, and smaller countries need to kowtow to its wishes in East Asia. So this is not just a regional order problem in Europe. It's a global order problem. Look, the Russian government, both before and after Putin took over, have been party to any number of international agreements, including legally binding treaties, a bilateral legally binding treaty between the Russian Federation and Ukraine that recognized Ukraine in its territorial confines as it emerged from the Soviet Union. They have violated all those. And in that sense, there is only one person who is responsible for this war, and that is Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. Eric, Evelyn, and Andrew, thank you for an incredibly interesting discussion. I learned a lot from all three of you, as I know our audience did as well. And I hope we can reconvene at some point later on to just get updated on where this stands. But for now, I want to thank our audience for tuning in and also invite you to please be sure to check out the blog that the Miller Center has established on its website on the Russian conflict, a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's updated regularly with really fascinating analysis and perspective on the crisis. But with that, once again, Eric, Evelyn, and Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today, and to our audience for tuning in. Good afternoon.
Thanks.